Hey you guys, welcome to Book Review 130. Today I am going to be reviewing The Reef, A Passionate History, The Great Barrier Reef from Captain Cook to Climate Change by Ian McClellan. There. Anyway, this is a very fascinating book about the history of the reef. It's not really a travel narrative per se, though the author at the very beginning kind of talks about him going to the reef. But what it really does is it talks kind of about the history of the reef post-European discovery, if you will. And it's really divided sort of into three parts. Terror, nurture, and wonder. And basically it kind of evolves how Europeans thought of the reef. The first was how terrifying it was, specifically with the early explorers, Captain Cook, Matthew Flinders. They mentioned that Captain Cook got kind of caught up in the reef and was only kind of able to escape through very vigilant 24-hour watch guards on his boat so they didn't run into the reef. Something interesting about the reef is that it starts north of Fraser Island and runs up to Papua New Guinea, but as it runs north, it runs parallel to the coast, more or less. But as it runs further north, the distance between the coast and the barrier reef shrinks. So that people that were kind of particular sailors that relied upon wind currents, that kind of went up into this trap almost, got stuck among reefs that they really couldn't get out of unless they found, unless they had extreme vigilance or they found a break in the reef. And that's actually what both Captain Cook and Matthew Flinders did. Beyond that, you got the story kind of the hot hack writer. It talks about, let me see here, some of the drama involving cannibalism early on in the reef. A lot of it had to do with people being stranded around the reef. Not exactly that Sydney or the rest of settled Australia in the early 1800s was the center of civilization, if you will. But there were towns, there was, order. But really north of Brisbane, there weren't any real towns at this point. So there were a lot of stories about transportation boats that would try to hit the Torres Straits to go up to Indonesia, or fishing boats or things of this matter that would get crashed on the reef, and then the people would be stranded, and those stories kind of evolved to a combination of fact and fiction. Now we can kind of suss nowadays what that fact and fiction was about how people were treated, these castaways, these people that were living along the reef. We can talk about how the Aborigines were, but at this time period there was a lot of mixing of fact and fiction, and because information just wasn't as prevalent or easy to access, there was a lot of dramatic flourishes in newspapers, in writings that had to do with this thing. And specifically, they talked a lot about, I should say the author's name, Ian talked a lot about sort of the Aborigines and how they were seen as subhuman, that they were essentially a lot of the fears that Europeans had, whether the Aborigines committed them or not. Some of the Aborigines did commit these, I guess by Western standards, crimes, you'd say. but a lot of them were just untrue and were reaffirming what the European media, specifically the English media, had as preconceived notions. Let's see what else we got. I guess I can kind of look through this a little bit. It's been a while since I've read this book, so yeah, it talks about wonder, kind of some of the early discoveries. Kind of talks about the first people that really went up there and saw it as a haven instead of just yeah, here's an example of a guy. Narcissi Pelletier, who was, that's an example of a Frenchman actually, that was working, I believe, with an English crew that got shipwrecked. And he was actually shipwrecked as a young boy. And so, although he had sort of these vague memories of France, he traveled with his parents, who I believe both died in the shipwreck. But although he had these vague memories of France, really the majority of his life, when they discovered him, I think in his early 20s, he had lived with Aborigines and therefore had extreme difficulty moving back to things like language or things like this. And they actually said that he eventually did move back to France as he recognized that he was a Frenchman, but felt quite lost the rest of his life, and I think died a pretty unhappy life. James Morrill was the other one that he was a little bit further north on the reefs, but he was also a young man that basically was raised by Aborigines. And it was almost sort of like a scientific study, like not in the way that like you would study like cultures nowadays, like I don't know, ethnographer or a cultural anthropologist or something like that. But almost sort of like a zoologist or somebody that studies biology about these subhuman Aborigines that live north of the reef. Let's see what else. Oh yeah, there was this interesting story about, let's see, William Kent. Yeah, William Kent, who became very famous as an early advocate of the reef. That he was a disciple of Darwin, this being when science was really moving into the evolutionary realm, into the realm of what the reef represented. But anyway, what was kind of interesting about this is that William Kent and his sister had a stepmother, this is all in England, that had another child by her father. I believe their mother had maybe passed away or something like that. Their mother had passed away or something like that. But anyway, they hated this stepmother because she despised them as well. And anyway, eventually this mother had a child who the children were, them being like 5 or 6 or 7 at this time period, were taking care of this infant. And this infant actually died under suspicious circumstances. And Constance, it's a woman's name, took the blame for it. And even though there was thought it was sort of like this co-thing between William and Constance. Well, anyway, after sort of struggling in Europe under a very kind of bleak sky, if you will, William, well, first of all, he actually excelled somewhat as a biologist in England. But he felt that he would be better suited by finding another country, by essentially starting over again. And so both him and his sister did. Now that moved to Australia. Now there's better records of William because he went on to become, he was first assigned to Tasmania and actually kind of fell out there, mostly because of politics, not because of his own, work skill or whatever. but he was eventually reassigned to the Reef, which a lot of people or a lot of scientists considered while intriguing, because it just wasn't the center of science or even close to like a major center like Melbourne or Sydney. Sort of like a backwater assignment. Well, what he found was he found all these species, this huge diversity of life, and it turned out to be actually a playground, a virtual paradise for a biologist, for a zoographer, if you want to call him that. And then I think he had some endeavors up there too. But he was really the first one that was kind of the call to conservation, the call to, well, if not conservation, at least studying the reef beyond sort of an exploitation manner that many of the other commerces had done along the reef. Let's see what else we got. Yeah, see, they got all these pictures. They're black and white pictures. I don't know if you can see them, but they're pictures of all the different reef sharks. Tim Codador. Oh yeah, the Banfields. They were kind of an early Thoreau, find your island kind of thing. Let me go back to the table of contents. Yeah, so now we're sort of moving into the wonder section. This Tim Banfield's Island Retreat Paradise was the last of the nurture section of it. And he really did try to create sort of like a paradise, but was actually largely reliant upon a lot of his Aborigine servants. They weren't slaves, he paid them, but kind of creating this false paradise almost, if you will. Of course, that's very intriguing to me. That's very intriguing to all of us. What's this Druk? Oh yeah, Druk was the name of the island. Yeah, now Druk is sort of half the island is a resort area. He talks a lot about how initially it was a paradise, but something about the reefs is that they get a lot of cyclones, the equivalent of like hurricanes or not tsunamis. Well, the equivalent of hurricanes in the typhoons. Typhoons and hurricanes are the equivalent of cyclones in Australia, and they can do a lot of damage. So in the first few years that Ted moved and created this paradise, it was very, if minimal on supplies, very sort of warm and balmy and had a lot of fruit, the beaches and, the idyllic lifestyle. But eventually, the house that he built was all torn down in one of these cyclones that famously hit. The irony being is that a cyclone hit these resorts later on. What do you want to do? Oh yeah, Ted he had all sorts of ideas for Druk Island. He wanted to create like this butterfly conservatory. He wanted to create, like a bird conservatory. He saw it as sort of like the first ecotourism place, or at least that's kind of, I'm not sure he used that word, but that's kind of where an early idea of what ecotourism could be. But after the hurricane, and I think there were two that eventually, like the first one damaged the island, but he went back, and the second one eventually just pushed him out. But he eventually started writing for a paper again, and by this point, Townsville was established as a sort of frontier city, big enough though that it could have a paper, and it could have a specific section dedicated to a desire that many people have, which is the idea of paradise. Alex Olaziz. Kind of in the later section, they talk a lot about how the reef was formed and how there were these battles between. And the idea that I sort of got was the reef what we now believe that it was a high shelf, and then the marine life, the zooplankton, the leftover reef also were those just the very top layer and the rest was rock below it? Or, interestingly enough, did the tides, and not just the tides, but sort of the currents of the great currents of the Pacific Ocean going all the way across the ocean, push all these zooplankton into the east coast of Australia, and therefore the reef was built kind of with organic matter from a much lower base and then just over time built up. I know definitely coral atolls nowadays. I think, well, the example like a Bora Bora, it's obviously very close to the surface because even though you have the coral that rings the island, you actually have the central high island, and that's something that's very common in the Pacific. I think what they eventually did find maybe was that the Australian coastline had a fairly low, like shallow shelf that the coral reefs built upon. And it wasn't that there wasn't significant enough coral over time. You know, there's obviously a lot of coral buildup in the rock itself. But I think what they found was that, like, going all the way from the depths of the ocean to where the reefs almost break the crest of the waves, in some places form islands along the Great Barrier Reef. That idea was just not possible. But that was kind of the argument in this section, and it was kind of between two people that eventually did that. It also had something to do, I forget exactly what it was, but it had something to do with Charles Darwin's work. I think it was a secondary position that Darwin had, that he said maybe it was mountains, that the reef were just kind of at the very top. But it was also sort of along the lines of wanting to disprove Darwin, just because if you discredit him once, then that brings under suspicion some of his other theories, which is kind of bupkis, but, or kind of BS, but it is what it is. I think also in this section they talked, there was another disciple, I believe, Alfred Mayer, that's right. Oh, no, there's Agassiz, as I said, I read this a while ago. The Agassiz was the one that was holding sort of the more conservative position that was trying to disprove Darwin. And then Alfred Mayer was the one that eventually, Darwin being, I think, dead by this point, but Alfred Mayer was the one that eventually confirmed Charles Darwin's long-held suspicion. See if I can see anything at the end of this chapter that kind of talks about it. Yeah, in the end, Charles Darwin's theory of coral substance was proved substantially correct, although it took a combination of technical advice and drilling and American war chest money to demonstrate it. So I guess it wasn't completely proven until, I'm guessing, it says the 1950s. Yeah, the coral that could only have grown in shallow waters. So the coral couldn't have grown in low enough waters for it to be anything, but formed on the top of mountains and shallow banks. Let's see. Well, let me get to the main area first. Talks about sort of the Cambridge movement onto these coral cays, the war. Let me get to the war part. That was pretty interesting. Yeah, I think there was somebody that said that they were like really depressed when the war went on because a lot of the funding got cut, all that kind of stuff. And they essentially became kind of a recluse on the Barrier Reef. Oh yeah, and then there was, yeah, oh, I know what it was. This was all about, Yeah, this was all about early drilling. So something interesting about the reef was not until relatively late in Australians' history was it considered a marine park. Um, and so there was thought that there was actually oil, which I don't know if that's been proven true or not in subsequent tests. Um, but Queensland, if you know anything about Queensland, is probably the most Texas of the Australian states. It's not super conservation minded, and it's very sort of pro mineral, pro development, pro wildcatter got a mindset. Which to a degree, those resources provide economy and provide jobs, and do everything that they do. But they were actually advocating. And I actually read in a later book about this guy. Was his name Jock Peterson, I think, who was kind of the George Bush, if you will. I don't know. That's kind of a rough comparison of Queensland, and he actually wanted to approve a deal that would allow American oil companies to set up drilling rigs on the reef itself. And there was a huge battle, and initially it looked like because all the government forces were behind the pro-drilling camp that this was going to happen. But I believe some people at the University of Queensland actually started a magazine that they called it the Ellison Reef Campaign. Yeah, so the thing wasn't really about the war. That's right. I think it did talk a little bit in another chapter about the war, but what the quote-unquote war, so I'm kind of backtracking or half remembering at this point. But what the thing about the war was about the development versus the conservationists. And I believe the conservationists eventually won. It largely coincided with sort of the hippie movement of the late 60s. Yeah. Talked to some about Harold Holt, who I believe was an Australian Prime Minister. Yeah, and it's yeah, it was a combination of like a publisher, a professor, and like an artist. And what was funny was that the artist in particular was was particularly cynical. I believe his name was Bust. And then there was yeah, and so they eventually fought and they won. The last couple chapters, I believe, are about kind of the future of the reef having to do with climate change. 80% of the reef has now been bleached, which there's some science that bleaching essentially killing the coral is the sign of a dead coral, much like you would see like a bone without any, marrow or blood vessels within it. But there's been some talk that coral regenerates fairly well, so it goes through periods of bleaching. But still, it's very disconcerting that that much of the reef has been bleached, and there's really a major concern, and some scientists are saying an inevitability, that the reef is going to be extinct. They don't know exactly what's going to replace it, how that's going to affect the Queensland coastline or the Queensland the ecosystem along the coastline. But there's just a lot of sort of very negative thoughts about it. And my hope would be that the reef can pull through, and that this more just has to do with kind of El Nino systems continually hitting the reef. But the real fear is, I think it is climate change. And the thing that's kind of ugly, and I'll kind of end with this, about climate change. Climate change is bad, and people that are trying to prevent greenhouse gases entering the atmosphere are obviously good. But the thing that's kind of scary is, like, when you have an individual point polluter, it's much easier to deal with them. But with greenhouse gases, we're really talking about sort of a worldwide pollution source. You know, I drive a car. The chances are that you probably drive a car that runs on carbon. And we don't see necessarily the effects in our everyday lives. But I'm just hoping that like the Great Barrier Reef is not the canary in the coal mine, because there's been major ecological havoc reaped on the reef. And so maybe we just all need to think about what the effect we have on the earth beyond what our individual lives are. Okay, so that was kind of a rambling thing about the reef. A lot of great stuff on conservation, a lot of stuff great on history, a lot of stuff great stuff on, you know, exploration history. It's a really good book, and it really kind of gives you a sense of what the reef is and how it came to be. Not merely the ecologically what makes it up, which is covered in a very small part of this book, but isn't the majority of the book, but really what it means to the larger world, what it means to people, the effects that it has, and you know, its history, as the book says. Okay, so the title of the book is The Reef, A Passionate History, The Great Barrier Reef from Captain Cook to Climate Change by Ian McClellan. All right, keep checking out my reviews, you guys. Yeah, this is a great book. Check it out. All right, see ya.